The story begins on a night when every satellite feed, every drone camera, every set of American eyes watching the Middle East saw the same thing. Something was moving toward a U.S. convoy that wasn't supposed to exist. A convoy the Pentagon never acknowledged. 36 Americans, riding in 3 armored vehicles, rolling through a valley that intelligence analysts later described, very politely, as a bad choice. But the truth was simpler. A sandstorm had pushed them off their planned route, and now they were in the wrong canyon, surrounded by ridgelines that didn't belong on the mission map. At the Combined Air Operations Center, an Air Force controller leaned forward in his chair when he spotted 3 heat signatures on the drone feed. Fast, coordinated, unmistakably armed. Not amateurs. Not villagers. Fighters with training, with vehicles, and with a very specific purpose. At the same moment, 38,000 feet above the border, Captain Mason Hale, call sign Ghost Lead, sat inside an F-22 Raptor, his hands resting lightly on the throttle as the jet knifed through the darkness. He was not supposed to be anywhere near that convoy. His mission was routine, a presence flight, a show of force. Nothing happens tonight kind of patrol. But something was happening, and he was the only aircraft in position. When the call came through his headset, it wasn't shouted. It wasn't urgent. It was surgical. Ghost Lead, new coordinates. Possible troops in contact. You're the closest thing we have. Mason didn't answer right away. He looked down at his fuel, looked at his weapons, looked at the NAV map, and then he quietly rotated the Raptor, so gently that no one on the ground would have ever known a 19-ton aircraft had just changed the fate of everyone in that canyon. The F-22 slipped into a shallow descent, invisible to every radar within 800 miles. On the ground, the convoy commander was shouting over the storm. His men couldn't see 5 meters ahead. They could barely hear their own engines. But they could hear something else. Small pops echoing through the canyon walls. Rifle rounds. Someone was firing blind into the storm, testing range, drifting closer. Is air support even tracking us? Someone yelled. The commander didn't answer. He didn't want to lie. Up above, Mason eased the Raptor through the storm's upper edge. Lightning flashed around the canopy, but inside the cockpit, everything was quiet. Familiar. He'd flown in worse. The Raptor wasn't bothered. The turbulence didn't even rattle the HUD. The drone feed finally caught the attackers clearly. 3 technical trucks with mounted heavy machine guns, approaching from the east, using the storm as camouflage. They were 30 minutes away from the convoy. Then 20. Then 15. At the COC, the operations chief asked the room, "Who else do we have airborne?" The silence that followed told him everything. It would be the Raptor. Only the Raptor. Mason dialed in the IRST, letting the sensor peer through the storm. The screen bloomed with thermal silhouettes, hot engines, bodies, weapons. Too many to count fast. He marked the targets quickly, tagging each with a tiny glowing square. But he wasn't cleared to fire. That was the problem no one wanted to say out loud. F-22s don't do close air support. Not in storms. Not at night. Not in bad terrain. Not with friendlies barely visible on sensors. Every rule in the book said the same thing: don't risk it. But 36 Americans were down there. Mason could feel his heartbeat in his hands. Not from fear, from calculation. He knew exactly what would happen if those attackers broke through the outer dunes. The convoy had line-of-sight problems. Limited ammo. No air visibility. They would never see the first burst coming. He pushed the Raptor lower. At 12,000 feet, he broke through the upper wall of sand, entering the storm's throat, where the winds corkscrewed like angry rivers. The jet trembled for the first time all night, and Mason gripped the stick tighter. He wasn't fighting the storm. He was dancing with it. Every adjustment was small, measured. On the ground, The attackers fired a green flare, signal to advance. Through the Raptor's optics, Mason watched the trucks begin to fan out. They thought they were invisible. They thought the storm made them gods. They didn't know the most advanced fighter jet on Earth was hovering above them like a shadow with fangs. "Ghostly," the controller said. "Our guys are stuck. They've dismounted. They're forming a perimeter, but visibility is zero. They can't move. They can't retreat." Mason exhaled. Then he said it. "I see the threat. I'm going in." He didn't wait for approval. He forced the Raptor lower, leveling at a height so dangerous that the jet's own sensors flashed warnings about terrain. The storm swallowed the aircraft entirely. No stars, no horizon, nothing but sand, and the faint hum of engine vibration. But he still wasn't cleared to fire. Instead, he hit the Raptor's external lights, full blast. Down in the canyon, every fighter froze. A streak of white light tore across the storm, illuminating the sand like lightning made of metal. The roar followed a half-second later, a deep rolling thunder that felt like the earth itself was growling. The attackers stumbled backward, shielding their eyes. They didn't know what they were looking at. They couldn't see the plane. They only saw the sky erupt. Mason made a second pass, slow, methodical, letting the Raptor's afterburner ignite for a brief second. The sound shook the canyon walls so hard that rocks loosened from the cliffs and clattered down the slopes. The attackers hesitated. The convoy commander lifted his head. That's an F-22, he whispered, as if saying it out loud might make the storm disappear. It didn't. But the enemy stopped advancing. They weren't retreating yet, but they weren't advancing either. They sat in that gray twilight of hesitation, trying to figure out what kind of ghost stalked the storm. Mason pulled up sharply, climbing out of the sand. He needed to do more. Fear alone wouldn't send these fighters home. He angled the jet, circled wide, and came back on an approach vector that would put him directly behind the attackers. His thumb hovered near the fire control switch. One tap would end the problem. But he still didn't have clearance. "Ghostly," the controller said. "Your ROE status is..." Static drowned the transmission. The storm was cutting the signal. Mason made the decision for himself. He throttled to military power, dove low again, and lined up behind the trail truck. He angled the jet perfectly, adjusting for wind, for sand, for distorted imaging. Then he snapped the Raptor's wings left and right in a violent, deliberate maneuver known to pilots as the Predator Flash, a burst of motion meant to unsettle anything on the ground watching. The attackers saw it. They heard it. They felt it. The truck gunners panicked first, firing wildly into the storm, spraying rounds at an enemy they couldn't see. This was the moment Mason had waited for. Not attack. Confuse. He cut throttle abruptly, causing the sound signature to vanish. The silence was worse than the roar. The fighters spun around, scanning the sky, terrified that the jet had simply teleported. Mason reappeared 200 meters above them. The sonic boom cracked through the canyon like a hammer blow. That was the breaking point. The first truck reversed, tires skidding across the sand. The second truck followed, its gunner ducking low. The third tried to hold position, but finally gave up when a rockslide, triggered by the sonic shockwave, tumbled down near its bumper. Within seconds, the attackers were retreating, leaving only dust and panic behind them. Up above, Mason steadied the Raptor, breathing hard. He didn't fire a shot. Didn't drop a bomb. Didn't need to. But 36 Americans were alive because of him. Part 1 ends as Mason watches the retreating trucks vanish into the storm, knowing the night isn't over, and the Pentagon will never officially admit what he just did. For a moment, the storm fell strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that only happens after chaos, when the air feels like it's holding its breath. Mason leveled the Raptor again, letting the jet ride the turbulent winds while he scanned the canyon for any movement. His fuel numbers were starting to dip into the margin pilots don't talk about. The "don't screw around anymore" margin. But he couldn't leave. Not yet. The convoy was still blind, still stuck, still surrounded by terrain that looked like a digital nightmare on Mason's HUD. They had no idea the threat had retreated. They didn't know if it was a feint, or if the fighters were circling around for a second push. All they knew was that something massive had roared over their heads, something they had only seen in recruitment posters or in the distant sky during air shows. They didn't know the Raptor had saved them. Down on the ground, a young specialist crawled through the sand toward his lieutenant, cupping his hands around his mouth to shout. "Is air support engaging? Sir, what the hell is going on?" The lieutenant didn't answer. He didn't know. All he knew was that something was out there in the storm, and whatever it was, the enemy feared it more than they feared 36 tired Americans with dust in their teeth and rifles jammed with sand. The storm thickened, swallowing the convoy again. Men coughed, shielding their faces, trying to peer through the swirling wall of grit. The radio crackled with broken half-sentences. Static. Wind. Breathing. Every sound felt heavier. And then they heard it. A single, low rumble, distant but growing, the sound of a predator returning for its prey. Mason brought the Raptor around for another pass, tuning his sensors with micro-adjustments, slicing through interference the way a surgeon works through damaged tissue. Every gust of wind shook the nose of the aircraft. Every column of rising hot sand distorted his optics. But he was calm. F-22 pilots aren't taught to fear chaos. They're taught to own it. He angled the Raptor into a long, curving path that would give him a full picture of the canyon. If the attackers were regrouping, he'd see them. If they were getting reinforcements, he'd see that too. And that's when the threat reappeared. Not in front of the convoy. Behind them. A fourth truck, previously unseen on any satellite pass or drone feed, crept along the southern ridge. It was bigger. Heavier. Armored. Its infrared signature looked like a furnace on Mason's display, suggesting an oversized engine and probably a large-caliber weapon mounted on top. This one hadn't been scared off. This one had been waiting. Mason tightened his jaw. If that truck reached the drop-off point overlooking the convoy, it would have a clean shot from the high ground. The men below would never see the first burst of fire. They were pinned in the canyon, boxed in by terrain they couldn't escape. Mason lowered the Raptor. He flew lower than he had any right to. Lower than any instructor would have approved. The storm was trying to tear the jet apart. Dust hammered the fuselage. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The Raptor sensors flickered under the strain, recalibrating every few seconds. But Mason didn't need calibration. He knew the canyon now, the shapes, the shadows, the curves, like a second cockpit. He throttled up, letting the engines push the jet into a controlled glide, slow and deliberate. The fourth truck was inching along the ridge, its headlights barely visible through the storm. Each bounce of its suspension moved it closer to the ledge. Mason toggled to weapons. And for the first time tonight, the fire control system gave him a tone. He had a lock. He hesitated. Not because he doubted the shot, he didn't. He could put a missile through the truck's hood and never touch a single grain of sand around it. His hesitation came from somewhere else. Once he fired, there would be no hiding the Raptor's involvement. No plausible deniability. "No, we can neither confirm nor deny." Briefing. The Pentagon didn't want anyone to know the Raptor was here tonight. But 36 lives didn't care about Pentagon politics. Mason made his decision. He armed the MROM. And then, the truck headlights disappeared. For one chilling second, Mason thought the storm had swallowed them again. But no. They were still there. The truck had simply stopped. Something was moving behind it. Mason's optics sharpened, revealing 2 more heat signatures emerging from the dunes. 2 fighters carrying something long, heavy. A shoulder-fired missile. An ATGM. Not meant for vehicles. Meant for helicopters. Or low-passing aircraft. Mason sucked in breath. They weren't here for the convoy. They were waiting for him. He pushed the Raptor into a climb, just as the missile team braced the launcher against the truck's door. The storm whipped at the launcher, but the fighters held steady. They'd done this before. Then a streak of white fire ripped upward. The ATGM launched. Mason banked hard, pulling a turn so violent that the jet's internal structure groaned under the strain. G-forces pressed against his body, crushing his ribs inward. The missile cut through the storm, following the faint heat signature of his engines. He killed throttle. The Raptor went nearly silent. The missile lost lock for half a heartbeat, just enough. Mason reignited the engines, blasting the jet sideways in an impossible, physics-defying maneuver that only an F-22 could survive, let alone execute. The missile screamed past his wingtip, disappearing into the dunes. Mason steadied the Raptor, breathing heavily. They weren't retreating. They weren't disorganized. They were hunting him. Down on the ground, the convoy saw the explosion through the sand, a flash of white light bending like lightning, followed by a distant boom that echoed through the canyon. Men ducked instinctively, covering their heads. No one knew what had caused it. But they all felt the same thing. Something massive was happening above them. Something impossible. Above the canyon, Mason rolled the Raptor back into position. He had a decision to make. He could climb out of the storm, save fuel, regroup, and wait for reinforcements. It would be the safe choice. The logical choice. It would also doom the convoy. He dove. The storm grabbed the aircraft, shaking it violently. The HUD flickered. Sand scraped across the canopy so loudly it sounded like hail. Mason's breathing grew shallow as he steadied the jet. No more warnings. No more hesitation. He locked onto the ridge. No missiles. Too risky. He'd used the Raptor's cannons, far more precise, far more controlled in a storm. He armed the gun. The ridge came into view again, distorted by dust. The truck was there. The fighters were there. The missile launcher was being reloaded. Mason lined up the shot. He squeezed. For a moment, nothing. Then the Gu-22 cannon erupted. A brutal, mechanical snarl that tore through the storm in a rapid, precise burst. Not a spray. A surgical strike. The rounds hit the sand just short of the targets, exploding into a plume that engulfed the ridge. The concussion alone knocked the fighters backward. They scrambled, scattering down the slope. The missile launcher tumbled, bouncing wildly before vanishing into the storm. The armored truck veered sideways. Then it rolled. The ridge, softened by the storm's erosion, crumbled beneath its weight. The truck slid, flipped, and crashed down the ravine, coming to rest in a cloud of dust and fire. Mason pulled out hard, climbing through the storm until he broke into open sky. The sudden clarity made his eyes ache. Stars flickered overhead like distant beacons. His radio crackled again, faint but readable. Ghost lead. Ground reports enemy retreat confirmed. Convoy still pinned. They can't move until the storm breaks. What's your fuel? Mason checked. Bad. He could stay a few more minutes. Maybe 5. No more. Copy, he said. I'll hold as long as I can. He circled above the storm, a silent guardian watching over the canyon, the men below unaware that the jet trembling through the night sky was the only reason they were still alive. Minutes passed. Then the storm began to thin. Wind softened. Visibility grew. The sand wall dissolved into drifting haze. For the first time all night, the convoy commander saw shapes ahead, Their own trucks, their own men, each face smeared with dust and exhaustion. And above them, a silhouette. A single aircraft gliding overhead, wings angled like the blades of a hunter. The commander stared, barely breathing. "That's no ordinary jet," someone said beside him. "No," the commander whispered. "That's the one they never send unless things are really bad." The Raptor dipped its wings. A silent salute. The men on the ground raised their hands, waving back even though they knew the pilot couldn't see them. Maybe he could. Maybe he didn't need to. Mason checked his final fuel numbers. This was it. He'd done all he could. "Convoy," he said quietly into his mic, knowing they'd never hear him. "You're going to be okay." He turned the Raptor toward friendly airspace. The storm faded behind him, and the canyon grew silent again. Hours later, after the convoy was extracted, after the storm cleared, after intelligence confirmed that the attackers had fully withdrawn, the official report was filed. It simply read, "Air support responded. Enemy disengaged." No mention of the Raptor. No mention of Mason. No mention of the fourth truck, the missile, or the impossible maneuvers inside the storm. No mention of the 36 men who survived because one pilot broke the rules, defied the weather, and fought an enemy that never should have caught them off route in the first place. The Pentagon would never talk about this mission. But the men in that convoy? They would never forget it. Somewhere in a debriefing room, Mason sat alone, helmet resting beside him, sand still embedded in his flight suit seams. He wasn't thinking about the politics, or the secrecy, or the parts of the mission that would be scrubbed from existence. He was thinking about the moment he'd seen the convoy's heat signatures, those tiny flickering shapes trapped in a canyon they couldn't escape, and how he'd known, instantly and without hesitation, what he needed to do. Because the truth was simple. A pilot doesn't fly into a storm to be a hero. He flies into a storm because somebody down there needs him. And that night, 36 Americans did. And the F-22 answered.